The Ghost by Katharine Tynan, published in the Christmas number of the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News, December 1905. Read by Bethina. The air of the room chilled him to the bone, although a rosy fire leaped and sparkled in the grate, and outside the day was St. Luke's summer. "Well," he said, "cold it is, Cousin Juliet," and he shivered. Juliet Darcy stood up by the marble mantelpiece. She was nearly the height of the low-ceilinged room. She was a ripe, fair, golden-skinned girl, and her trailing gown of orange tawny consorted well with her coiled fair plaits and the apricot bloom of her cheeks. "I am never cold, Cousin Humphrey," she said, "but a good many people have made the same complaint about this room. It ought to be warm, for there is a fire here nearly all the year round. There are cellars underneath this part of the house too, so it ought to be dry." Except for the dank chill of the atmosphere, the room was cheerful and pleasant, walled in old chintzes with a pattern of sprawling cabbage roses, carpeted in blue with a design of rose wreaths. Every one of the chintz chairs and couches was comfortable. The foot sank in soft-piled rugs. There were all sorts of precious bric-a-brac about on the shelves and in cabinets. It was lived in, too. There was an open book on a little table. Another was heaped with books and magazines. An embroidery frame was pushed into one corner. Lady Darcy's work-basket stood by her low chair. "It is perhaps the autumn damp," Humphrey Elmer replied. The windows were not yet shuttered, although a shaded lamp had been lit. Between the silk hangings of the window the park outside showed heavy in mist. By day the prospect was a fair one, miles and miles of coppice and undulating land, a herd of deer feeding, ready to go like the wind at the sound of a step. In middle distance the river winding in and out glade and coppice, dim on the horizon a range of distant hills. His eyes came back to his young cousin. She was pleasanter to look upon than the October afternoon landscape. "Aunt Lucy still likes the lodge?" he said. "We are still in love with the lodge," she answered. "It is such a dear little home-like house, so different from Greyfell among its melancholy moors. And this garden country is enchanting. You will see for yourself to-morrow. We have never regretted Greyfell. Then this is so much nearer town, and there are pleasant neighbours." There was the slightest hesitation as she concluded the speech. He looked at her kindly. How she had grown up, little Jew! She was quite a beauty, and in time Mary and Kate, her sisters, would be as handsome. He knew his aunt's wishes about him and Juliet. The girl was heart-whole, ready to be wooed and won. He had come with no unwilling mind to the wooing and winning. Yet, now that they were alone together, he was in no haste to begin. He had an idea that their being alone was his aunt's doing. It was Sunday afternoon, and she had found something she must do in her own room upstairs. The other two girls had gone out to visit a friend. A Sunday quiet was over the house. One imagined the servants reading their Bibles in their own premises. If a foot went along the corridor, it went with a more subdued tread than of weekdays. The lodge and its gardens and park felt the suspended animation of the great town like a heaviness. "When I saw you last, Cousin Ju, you were only so high," he said, watching with lazy pleasure the lights and shadows of the fire on her face and her velvet gown. Before you went away? Before I went away. I had no idea I should be gone for so long that you would have had time to grow completely out of my memory. I haven't grown, have I? Poor mamma! A smile played about the corners of her mouth. It is hard on her to have 3 such enormous girls. You can't imagine what yards of material it takes to make us our dresses. I can only realize how excellent the result is in your case, he said. The wooing and the winning were going to be very pleasant, he felt. She was as wholesome and delicious as a ripe fruit. Of almost too opulent beauty for her 20 years, she yet carried her youth in the swift lightness of her movements, in the shyness of her eyes. He liked to play with the shyness. You have been growing beautiful, he said, while I have been growing old and ugly, burnt as black as a crow by the sun, tanned by the sea wind. Do you know, Dew, that I am growing grey-haired? Oh, no, she said in a shocked way. Why, you are not so much older than I. 9 years. When you were a Greyfell, you were 19 and I was 10, and I adored you. Quite young people are grey-haired nowadays. Old? Oh, no, nor ugly. You are very far from being ugly, Cousin Humphrey. He liked her vindication of him against his own half-jesting words. You were a dear little girl at 10, he said, and was pleased to see the shy perturbation of her face, which he thought to be for him. She had looked up in a startled way at the window. Someone had passed it, coming along the terrace to the hall door. Aylmer, sitting with his back to the window, had not noticed the passing figure. There was a tinkle of the hall door-bell. The maid came in and announced, "Mr. Hugh Young." The owner of the name followed, a tall, fair young giant, inconveniently big for the low room crowded with furniture. Juliet introduced the 2 men. Aylmer got up, remembering suddenly that he had not a pipe since lunch. He would smoke one on the lawn outside while the light yet lingered. He had 2 little rooms just across the narrow corridor to his own use. They and the drawing-room were divided from the rest of the house by an arch. They were, in fact, the oldest portion of the house and dated back some centuries. The fire had been lit already in his bedroom and had burned up brightly, but there, too, the air struck coldly. It ought not to be so cold, he said to himself. I wonder if, by any chance, there is water in the cellars. The place smells like a grave. He found his pipe and tobacco pouch and went out. He had an idea that if he stayed out long enough, Mr. Hugh Young might take his departure. While he walked up and down, the maidservant came and closed the outside shutters of the windows. The mist of damp spread whiter and whiter across the park till the shapeless masses of the trees were swallowed up in it. He wished Mr. Hugh Young would go. What deuce did the young puppy mean by coming in and monopolizing Juliet? At the firelit hour, too, when he had been feeling so comfortable, so complacent about that plan of Aunt Lucy's. It was time for him to give up roaming and settle down. Quite time that he should give a mistress to King's Oak. And where could he find a girl sweeter, more wholesome, more stately, yet with a young charm, than his cousin Juliet? He began to fidget at length. Would the fellow never go? Was Aunt Lucy about? He wondered if Juliet often entertained Mr. Hugh Young tête-à-tête. To be sure, she had been left to entertain him, but that was different. They were cousins. At last he shook out the ashes of his pipe violently on a green paling and went back to the house. There was no one in the drawing-room. It was in obscurity. Someone had taken away the lamp, and the fire had sunk to a little red glow. A maid came along the corridor. "If you please, sir," she said, "Miss Juliet took the lamp into the library for a minute. She will return directly." He answered that it did not matter, and sitting down to the piano he began to play. That was something which had never deserted him, music and the solace of music. He was a born musician, and with his hands on the keys he lost consciousness of all that irked him or might irk him. He forgot himself, where he was, everything but the music. As he played dreamily, passing from one thing to another, now improvising, again playing from a well-stored memory, he had suddenly the oddest sense of a presence in the room. There was the rustle of silk. Something brushed against his shoulder. Something lighter than thistledown rested on his hair, touched his lips. His hands fell from the keys. As the music ceased, there was a sound like the winnowing of softest wings. Something grey like the twilight went out by the open door. But though it was shadowy, it had the eyes and the hair, the slender sylph-like figure of a young girl. He sprang to the door and caught sight of her, as he believed, entering the little suite of rooms that was his. He followed, and found the first room in such dim firelight as the drawing-room had been. He fumbled for a candle and lit it. There was an arch between his bedroom and the other room, which was a dressing-room. He had hardly yet made acquaintance with it, since he had only come to the lodge in time for lunch. As he went in, holding the candle high above his head, he noticed the bitter chill in the fireless room. There was something cold and clinging about it. He looked round the room. It had little low windows sunk deep in cavernous walls. The blinds were down over them. There was the same comfortable chintz-covered furniture which was all over the house. There was a big wardrobe. He opened the doors of it. There was within only emptiness. For the rest, nothing could be more homelike than the aspect of the room. His bath was set ready for the next morning in the middle of the floor. The lodge did not boast a bathroom. His dressing-gown was hung over the back of a chair. His portmanteau had been unstrapped and lay open, and was apparently in process of unpacking. He held the candle nearer to the pictures on the wall. They were old, dim oil paintings. The sky and the olive groves of Tuscany shone out of one. He went on to the next, a portrait. Ah! He felt as if he had known the face always. It was suddenly as though he had left the normal, natural, living world behind and stepped across the borders of the supernatural. He had been in many strange places of the world. He had been in many perils and dangers, and had known many excitements. Never had his heart beaten so violently before. As he stared at the soft, pale, melancholy face of the portrait, he hardly wondered to hear a sigh at his ear. It was a little sigh, and for a moment there was the quiet breathing, as of a young child somewhere close by him. The girl in the portrait wore a straight, short-waisted frock of white satin. She had pearls about her neck. There was a string of pearls in her hair. Her soft, childish arms were folded about a little lapdog. There was something of the moony mystery of the pearls in the fair face, pale against a background of trees and darkness. The eyes were appealing. As he replaced the picture, the presence seemed to pass away from the room. The wind rose and sighed about the house. He was conscious of no supernatural fear, only of a great interest. Was it possible he had seen a ghost, and such a sweet one? Poor little lonely child, what was her history? She looked as though she needed comforting, tenderness. What an elusive, poetic little face it was! He went back to the drawing-room, which once more was bright with fire and lamplight. Mr. Hugh Young and Juliet were alone in the room. When he came in, the lad stood up to go with an apology for so long a visit. He noticed that his cousin did not seek to detain her visitor. Looking at her, he had an odd idea that her ears listened finely as though for a step on the stairs. Was it possible that Aunt Lucy's daughters were a little afraid of her? It struck him with a faint sympathetic amusement that Mr. Hugh Young was perhaps a person in disfavour with Lady Darcy. After the youth had taken his departure, Juliet came a little closer to him and looked down at him with the fair and frank expression which had struck him at first as her greatest beauty. It was the more alluring because it was mixed now with something shy and mischievous. "Cousin Humphrey," said she, "mamma, who has been asleep, I expect, all this afternoon, when she wants an afternoon nap, she is always supposed to be reading or writing letters or turning out drawers, anything at all but having a nap. Mamma would be very angry with me if she knew that I had been entertaining Mr. Hugh Young instead of you this afternoon." "She need not know it as far as I am concerned, Cousin Ju," he answered, "and I congratulate you on your choice. He is a very fine specimen of young manhood." At that she blushed rosily red. "It has not come to a choice yet, Cousin Humphrey," she said. "I should say it has on his side," he answered, enjoying the sight of her blushes. He forgot that a little while ago he had not felt so benevolent. "He's a subaltern in a cavalry regiment," she said. "He only exists there by favour of his aunt. She means him to marry a rich girl, and you know that mamma's income dies with her. She has saved nothing. I ought to marry a rich man. Hugh talks of giving up the cavalry and going into an Indian regiment, where there would be the hard work of soldiering. He says that he feels he is where he is on false pretences. If he displeases Mrs. Molyneux in his marriage, for instance, she will do nothing for him. It is a creditable attitude of mind for him. Still, tell him to wait a little, Cousin Ju. I am your nearest male relative, and I have more money than I know what to do with. Why should I not look after my young cousin?" Her sisters came in, bringing a breath of the autumn evening with them. They were still immature, boyish, without the consciousness of sex. He said to himself that he was lucky to have such cousins. For the first time he felt a glow of pleasure in the possession of kindred. Lady Darcy followed on her daughter's footsteps. The tea came in. Her ladyship announced, with a little yawn behind her hand, that she had had a busy afternoon. "Mr. Young called," said Juliet. "Ah, I thought I heard a ring at the front door." There was chagrin in the mother's voice. Aylmer said to himself that he was proud of Juliet. She might so easily have said nothing about the call. He had come at last to utter the question which had been on his lips for the last half hour. "There is a little portrait of a girl in my dressing-room, Aunt Lucy," he said. "It interests me. Do you know who it is?" "Not at all, Humphrey. When I bought the lodge, I bought also a certain amount of its furniture. Those pictures were there when we came." "Who were the previous owners of the lodge?" "A family named Warner. They had been at the lodge from time immemorial. I gathered from something the house agent said that the last representatives of the family were an old man and a child, grandfather and granddaughter. Even the sale of the lodge meant little to them. There were so many claims to be satisfied. They were very poor, I believe." He took occasion later on to ask Lady Darcy if there was any ghost story in connection with the lodge, telling her something of his experience. "We have never seen anything," Lady Darcy replied. "Some of the servants said they saw or heard something. I put it down to the fancy of a hysterical housemaid. They are so easily alarmed. Such stories spread like wildfire. Already I find it difficult to keep servants here. The lodge is so lonely, they say." She looked at him with an anxiety which made him laugh. "I shall certainly not talk to the servants, Aunt Lucy," he said. "Nor to the children? I shall not be so ill-mannered as to pretend to a knowledge of this skeleton in the lodge cupboard. Besides, you know, Humphrey, I believe it was an illusion of the firelight and the shadows. By the way, I heard your music in a dim way. It was enough to call up a ghost to hear it. What weird thing were you playing?" He was relieved to find that she did not ask him where Juliet was at the time. She was so surprised at Humphrey's story that it put her daughter out of her head. "I should never have given you that room, my dear Humphrey," she said apologetically, "if I had believed in such stories. Would you like to change and go upstairs? You can have Arthur's room if you like." Arthur was the only son of the house, a naval lieutenant, and away with his ship. "Not for worlds, my dear aunt," Humphrey said, with an emphasis that surprised the lady. "I assure you I am not at all afraid of ghosts." He was conscious, indeed, of a desire to see the ghost again, the strength of which rather surprised himself. He had not long to wait. She came to him between sleep and waking. She was in his dreams. From the dark background of his sleep her little face glimmered pale as ivory. He came to know that face as it was revealed to him far more distinctly than her portrait had revealed it. The face was hardly beautiful, only young and soft and pale, with limpid eyes and the haze of dreams upon it for its expression. She hovered over him, reminding him of a picture he had seen somewhere of the angel guardian. Her hands seemed extended over him in a tender protection. She came night after night. If she left asleep unvisited, he was conscious of a strange loneliness. As he played in the dark of afternoon and evenings, she would come and sit by the piano. Music always seemed to bring her. He used to play to her, putting a new spirit and heart into the music. He used to wonder at the others that they did not seem to see her sitting there, partly retired into the shadows, her face and her dress gleaming like moonlight. But apparently the vision of her was only for him. He stayed on week after week at the lodge. Lady Darcy was well pleased about it, that he, who had always led a life of strenuous activities, should be content to settle down through October and November at the lodge, where there was not even shooting to be done. She knew that he had received many invitations elsewhere. They rained upon him once people knew that he had returned home, but he accepted none of them. It was pleasant, he said, to the delighted woman, to be with his kin, the only kin he had. Why should he go further for pleasure? There was some subtle change about Humphrey. He was absent-minded, and at times a little odd in his manner. Lady Darcy had caught his eyes with an expression of seeing something where, for her, there was an empty room. And that passion of his for music! Every afternoon he was at the piano. He was plainly not pleased if he had to be anywhere else. And the sounds he awoke from the piano, which was an old thing, were something new in the experience of Lady Darcy and her children. It was uncanny, as Juliet said. Juliet was on those terms with Humphrey that she could say what she would. The music he drew from the old piano was uncannily beautiful. He was quite well aware of the madness of his own obsession, though for the time he delivered himself to it. There were intervals when even the music did not bring her, and those were times of an arid loneliness and desolation to him. To be sure, when he could tear himself away from the lodge, he used to combat his own folly, and he was uneasily conscious all the time that his aunt misinterpreted his willingness to stay. He had meant to have done something for the young lovers before this. He had gone so far as to become friends with Mrs. Molyneux, who liked an adventurous man, and smiled kindly on Humphrey Aylmer from the first. He meant to pursue the friendship, to bring it to the point when he might broach the matter of her nephew and his young cousin. Juliet looked to him as a sort of providence. It touched him to find her frank, trustful regard upon him. At last it came to him that he must do something. He could not go on letting the little ghost fill the central niche in his life with her cold, incorporeal presence. He presented himself in the consulting room of a famous nerve specialist. They had met before and had conceived a cordial liking for each other. "Don't tell me that you are among the patients," Sir Richard said, glancing casually at the face over which a subtle difference had come since their last meeting. "I should have said that you were the soundest man I knew." "What do you think," Aylmer said quietly, "of a man who is in love with a ghost?" "But a pretty girl would be 1,000 times better." Aylmer unpacked his story, and the doctor listened with interest. "I don't doubt your word any more than I should doubt my own," he said, when Aylmer had finished. "You don't strike me as a person given to hallucinations. A good many men would tell you that your liver was out of order, your eyes wrong, your nerves gone to pieces. I see no trace of any of these things, but if you are really sure that it is a ghost and not some minx playing tricks on you, I would advise you first to go away. Get rid of the associations of the house. Afterwards find a young lady of flesh and blood to drive out this intangible mistress of yours. Don't go back. Be done with it now this minute. I assure you that if you allow the thing to go on, it will ultimately affect your mind. It is unwholesome, unnatural." "Thank you," Aylmer said with a wintry smile. "You have said precisely what I have been saying to myself. I believe it is very sound advice." When he had left Harley Street, he got down into Oxford Street and walked away westward. It was the dreariest hour of the day, the hour when vitality slackens and things seem not worth while. He walked as briskly as he could for the press of people. He wanted to be free of them, to be somewhere he could think his thoughts. The afternoon winter sun lit the sky with a cold splendour. It was full in his face as he went, dazzling in the absence of shade. All that great highway out of London was a golden path to the heart of the sun, which presently would drop below the horizon, giving way to a frosty night. The light flooding his eyes and his brain became in time intolerable. Halfway down the Bayswater Road he stopped in front of a red building of a curious shape. He had heard of the place before, but had never visited it. Why? Here was the rest he sought, the quiet thinking place, far from the eyes of men. He went into the building. Coming in from the aching light outside, he thought at first that he was alone. He sat down in a seat and, leaning back, closed his eyes. It wanted an hour to sunset, at which time the building would be closed. All about him were pictures of the life of our Lord on earth, comfortable, consoling pictures. He thought that the consolation was in the very air of the place. Blessed was she, he said to himself, who thought it had been to set such a wayside inn for weary travellers. Suddenly a little sigh broke on his ear. Just such a tender, weary sigh as he had heard when the ghostly presence was near him. He started up, wide-eyed. Was it possible that she was going to follow him here, wherever he went? No. He saw now that the person who had sighed was a young girl who had fallen asleep in a seat a little way behind him. Her shabby hat had fallen off. Her face, drooping forward, supported by her hand, was hidden by the pale hair which hung about her in a long straight mass. She was sighing in her sleep. The attitude of her slender body was one of utter weariness. He went towards her, knowing all the time what he should see. Why, the face was the face of the little ghost, but thank God, a living, breathing face. The ghost had prepared her the way. A sudden rush of great joy came over him. He had to control himself, or he would have taken the sleeping head to his breast. She opened her eyes and gazed at him without much surprise. There was something almost of recognition in her gaze. "My child," he said. He could hardly keep the pulsating passion out of his voice. "You had fallen asleep. You do not look well. Let me take you home." There were great shadows under her eyes, painful hollows in her cheeks and about her temples. She tried to stand upright, but she reeled a little, and he understood. "My God!" he cried, and the old caretaker of the place, who had peeped in curiously, was amazed at the anguish in his voice. "You are starving, starved! Come, I must get you some food at once." She went with him like a child. He took her to the nearest place where food was to be found and got her some soup. He watched her while she ate it, with the eyes of a mother who sees her sick child feed, quite unconscious of the amazed faces about him, or the discrepancy between his own appearance and the shabby girl's. She had only taken a few spoonfuls when she stopped and looked at him as though she had suddenly remembered. "My grandfather is ill in bed," she said in a whisper. "He has no food since yesterday. I had no money to buy him medicine. I was on my way to ask money from someone we used to know, when I felt ill and went into the chapel to rest." "Finish your soup," he said, "and we will go to him. We will bring him all he wants. Neither you nor he will ever want for anything again." He had no thought that he might seem rather mad to the girl, nor did she seem surprised. She looked at him with a passionate gratitude whilst she forced herself to eat some more of the soup. Her faithful brown eyes were the eyes of the ghost. He felt beside himself with joy because his ghost had become flesh and blood, because in the chapel of rest he had found his very heart's desire. He was hardly surprised when she told him, as they drove to that wretched street in the purlieus of Oxford Street, where her grandfather lay dying of want in a garret under the roof, that her name was Lucia Warner. "Everything went from us," she said, "in a long chancery suit. My grandfather has been teaching the violin. He was wretchedly paid. Little by little even his tuitions fell off, and he is very old. I taught the piano, but when I became so shabby no one would admit me into their houses. Why do you care so much? Is it because God sent you and put it into your heart to pity us?" "It is because God put it into my heart," he said. "Money can do much. The sick old man, though he was in heaven when he woke up, after a journey in an ambulance, in a fresh, sweet room amidst a silence of green fields, broken only by the singing of birds. After all, since his illness was only heartbreak, with the addition of privation, he soon grew well, being happy and well cared for, with the assurance of a peaceful old age before him. Being the dreamy visionary he was, it was hardly wonderful to him that Humphrey Aylmer should have fallen so suddenly and wildly in love with Lucia. It was easier to accept benefits from Lucia's husband, and the wooing was not long a doing. No one ever knew the circumstances in which Humphrey Aylmer had discovered Sir Michael Warner and his granddaughter. Every one, save Lady Darcy, were agreed as to the exquisiteness of the bride and the romantic and high-bred air of Sir Michael. And presently Lady Darcy was much pleased with Hugh Young for a son-in-law as she could have been with Humphrey himself. To be sure, Mrs. Molyneux had behaved most handsomely to the young couple, and Juliet, thanks to her cousin Humphrey, had not gone dowless to her groom. After a time it was the most natural thing in the world that Lady Darcy, having two daughters to talk about, should have grown tired of the lodge and been ready to hand it over to those who, as she said, had the best right to it. Her little house in Kensington Gore pleased her a deal better. The portrait of the ghost now hangs in the drawing-room at the lodge, and is frequently taken for that of Mrs. Aylmer. The ghost never came again, although she might have been attracted by the wailing of old Sir Michael's violin in those ghost rooms which he had chosen for himself. Ghosts are the last things one would ascribe to the lodge nowadays. So cheerful a habitation, full of laughter and peace, of love and the sound of children's voices, could never harbour anything so sad as a ghost. Lady Darcy and her daughters, coming and going, noticed that the unearthly chill has departed from the rooms that used to be called the ghosts. "Depend upon it," Lady Darcy says, "the house has stood so long empty that the damp had eaten its way in there, and now you have banished it with fires and lights." "Hearth fires and home lights," says Humphrey Aylmer, enigmatically. He has a theory that the little ghost grieved for those of her name who were in such sore straits, and now, in their well-being, is laid to rest. That was The Ghost by Katharine Tynan, an Irish author born in Dublin in 1859. She was a novelist and poet and was a friend of several poets and writers, including Gerard Manley Hopkins and William Butler Yeats. This heart-warming ghost story was written for the 1905 Christmas supplement of the Illustrated Sporting and Dramatic News called Holly Leaves. It is a gentle, romantic ghost story in which the ghost wants help from the man she haunts to right a wrong. The poverty-stricken people she wants to save are upper class, which is a slightly jarring note to the modern reader. Aylmer, though, would have brought shame upon himself if he had married a working-class woman fallen on hard times. Katharine Tynan was a Roman Catholic and contributed to Catholic periodicals, so although there is a ghost in this story, the ghost is really something of an angel and definitely not demonic or evil. I hope you enjoyed the story. Please remember to hit the like button and write a comment if you would like to. Finally, I'd like to wish a happy and peaceful Christmas to all the listeners and viewers of my audiobooks and videos. And as always, thank you for listening.